There is a stage of awakening so quiet, so unglamorous, that most people pass by it without realizing it was ever there a state, where nothing feels mystical anymore, where there are no visions to chase, no identities to wear, no enemies to fight, and because it offers no drama, no superiority, and no applause. Most turn back before they arrive. The collapse of the false self is not dramatic in the way the mind imagines transformation. There is no thunder, no applause, no sudden arrival at peace. Instead, there is a slow and unsettling recognition that the life once lived was organized around survival rather than truth to false. Self is not a lie in the moral sense. It is a structure, a psychological architecture, built early to secure safety, approval, belonging, and predictability. It forms through adaptation, through learning when to speak and when to stay silent, when to perform and when to disappear, when to please and when to resist over time. This adaptive structure hardens into identity. What began as protection becomes personality. What began as strategy becomes who I am. The false self thrives on coherence. It wants consistency, narrative, control. It tells a story about the self that makes life manageable. I am this kind of person. I believe these things. I act this way. I want these outcomes. As long as the story works, it feels stable, but awakening begins when the story fractures. This fracture does not come from failure alone. Often it arises after success, after the goals are achieved, and the satisfaction fades after approval is earned, and still something feels hollow after understanding increases and peace does not follow. The false self begins to lose its grip when its rewards no longer satisfy the deeper psyche. At first, this feels like confusion. Motivation weakens, certainties dissolve, the roles that once gave direction start to feel performative. Even spiritual identities can become suspect. The healed self, the aware self, the good self, all begin to feel like costumes worn too tightly. This is the beginning of collapse. What makes this stage so difficult is that nothing new immediately replaces what is falling apart. The psyche enters a liminal space. The old identity no longer convinces, the new has not yet formed. This creates anxiety, not because something is wrong, but because control is slipping. The false self depends on predictability. It needs to know how it will be seen, how it will be received, how it will protect itself from rejection or shame when it begins to dissolve. The individual may feel exposed, raw, unprotected. All defenses stop working. People-pleasing feels exhausting. Avoidance feels dishonest. Overachievement feels empty. Even rebellion loses its thrill. The collapse accelerates when the person stops repairing the mask. Instead of asking, how do I fix myself? A deeper question emerges. Who am I without this structure? This question has no immediate answer, and that is precisely what makes it transformative. The false self collapses not through force, but through exhaustion. It can no longer maintain the performance. The psyche refuses to continue a life that feels internally split. At this stage, shadow material rises, disowned emotions, unlived impulses, contradictory desires, the parts of the self that were once suppressed to maintain the image now demand acknowledgement. This can feel like regression if one is becoming less disciplined, less motivated, less certain. But what is actually dissolving is artificial coherence. The psyche is reorganizing itself around truth rather than adaptation. The collapse of the false self is often accompanied by grief, not only for what was lost, but for what was never lived. There is mourning for the years spent conforming, for choices made out of fear rather than alignment for relationship, maintained at the cost of authenticity. This grief is not pathological, it is corrective. As the false self weakens, something quiet begins to emerge, not a new persona, not a refined identity, but a capacity to tolerate ambiguity. You begin to act without fully knowing who you are becoming. You speak without rehearsing the outcome. You feel without immediately labeling the emotion. Life becomes less scripted. This stage demands immense inner courage because there is no external reassurance, no role to hide behind, no guarantee of approval. Yet, paradoxically, this is where real stability begins. The false self sought stability through control. The emerging self finds it through presence. Instead of asking how to be perceived, attention turns inward. Instead of managing impressions, there is an interest in inner alignment. Instead of defending identity, there is openness to contradiction. You begin to allow yourself to be inconsistent, to change, to disappoint. To not know this is not collapse as destruction. It is collapse as reorganization. The psyche sheds what was built to survive, so that something more essential can begin to live, not as an image, not as an ideal, but as a direct expression of inner reality, and once this process begins, it cannot be undone, because the mind has seen too clearly that the false self was never the source of meaning, safety, or wholeness in the first place, only a structure that delayed the encounter with the deeper. Self waiting beneath the performance integration begins where the desire to escape finally loses its power for much of inner work. Growth is imagined as transcendence, rising above fear, outgrowing pain, leaving behind anger, doubt, and vulnerability. The psyche is trained to believe that healing means elevation rather than inclusion. Escape is seductive because it promises relief. Without confrontation, it offers light. Without weight, peace. Without complexity, it frames darkness as an error to be corrected. Rather than a message to be understood in the early stages of awakening, escape often disguises itself as insight one learned. The language of awareness observes emotions from a distance, names patterns and behaviors. This can feel liberating, but observation alone does not transform. What remains unacknowledged, integration, begins when awareness turns toward what was previously avoided. The psyche contains opposites: strength and fear, love and resentment, clarity and confusion. These polarities are not mistakes, they are structural realities of being human. Escape seeks to eliminate one side of the polarity. Integration seeks to hold both without fragmentation. When escape dominates, parts of the self are exiled, anger is suppressed in the name of peace, need is denied in the name of independence, sensitivity is hidden in the name of resilience. What is pushed away does not disappear, it retreats into the unconscious, where it influences behavior indirectly. This is how an integrated material gains power, not through presence, but through invisibility. Integration requires turning toward what disturbs the self-image. This turning is not indulgence, it is responsibility. To integrate anger is not to act it out, it is to understand what boundary has been crossed. To integrate fear is not to obey, it is to hear what vulnerability it protects. To integrate sadness is not to drown in it, it is to acknowledge what was lost or never received. Integration is the slow process of restoring inner citizenship. To disown parts, this process dismantles the fantasy of purity, the idea that one can become entirely light, entirely calm, entirely healed. Such fantasies belong to escape. The integrated psyche accepts contradiction. It recognizes that compassion can coexist with firmness, that wisdom can coexist with uncertainty, that growth can coexist with grief, as acceptance does not weaken the individual, it stabilizes them. Escapist spirituality often seeks transcendence through detachment. Integration seeks grounding through embodiment. Instead of leaving the body, attention returns to it, to sensation, to emotion, to impulse. The body becomes the site of truth rather than an obstacle to it. This is uncomfortable because the body remembers what the mind avoided. Integration demands patience because unconscious material reveals itself in fragments, through moods, through reaction, through relational patterns. Each reaction becomes an invitation not to judge, not to suppress, but to inquire what part of me is speaking now. What does it need? What is it protecting? This dialogue transforms inner conflict into cooperation, escape fragment the self into ideals and shadows. Integration weaves these fragments into a cohesive whole. As integration deepens, behavior changes organically, not because of discipline, but because of coherence. You no longer act against yourself. Decisions feel less forced. Boundaries feel less aggressive. Emotions feel less overwhelming. The integrated self does not strive to appear enlightened. It strives to be aligned. This alignment brings a different kind of peace, not the peace of numbness, but the peace of internal agreement. Life no longer feels like a battleground between who you are and who you should be. The internal war quiet because opposing forces are no longer enemies. Integration also transforms relationships. You stop projecting disowned traits on others. What once triggered defensiveness now invites curiosity. What once demanded control now allows space. This does not mean relationships become easier, it means they become clear. You can see where responsibility ends and projection begins. Where love ends and fear takes over. Integration removes the need to escape through fantasy, through substances, through constant productivity, through spiritual bypassing. The present moment becomes tolerable because it is no longer resisted. This tolerance is not resignation, it is maturity. You realize that freedom does not come from leaving parts of yourself behind, it comes from carrying them consciously. The integrated psyche does not aim for perfection. It aims for wholeness, and wholeness includes complexity. Ambivalence, ambiguity. Escape narrows life to what feels safe. Integration expands life to what is real. This is why integration feels heavier at first, because it includes what was previously excluded, but over time, This weight becomes grounding. The psyche stands on its full truth rather than floating on selective awareness. Integration over escape marks a decisive shift. From fleeing inner darkness to standing within it without collapse, from seeking transcendence to embodying presence, from trying to become something else to allowing what is already there to exist without division. Loneliness is commonly experienced as a failure of connection, a sign that something has gone wrong, that one has been excluded, forgotten, or left behind. The psyche is conditioned to interpret isolation as danger because at a primitive level, separation once meant vulnerability and death. Yet, there is a form of loneliness that emerges not from rejection, but from transformation, not from abandonment, but from differentiation. This loneliness does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds quietly as inner alignment deepens, as the individual grows more honest with themselves. Certain patterns begin to fall away. Conversations that once felt engaging begin to feel hollow. Relationships built on shared defenses lose their coherence. Social roles maintained for belonging no longer fit. This creates a widening gap between inner experience and outer environment. The instinct is to resist this gap, to interpret it as something to be fixed, to search for immediate replacement, to force connection where resonance has faded. But in the process of psychological maturation, loneliness functions as a rite of passage. A rite is not meant to be avoided, it is meant to be endured. Consciously, this form of loneliness arises when the individual can no longer betray their inner truth for the sake of belonging, when they stop adjusting their perceptions to match the group, when they refuse to perform emotional contortions to remain accepted. What is lost here is not connection itself, but unconscious connection. The psyche is stepping out of collective identification, out of borrowed beliefs, out of shared illusions. This separation is necessary for inner authority to develop. Loneliness in this stage carries a distinct quality. It is not frantic, it is not desperate, it is often accompanied by clarity. There may be fewer conversations, but more silence, fewer attachments, but deeper presence, less noise, but more coherence still. Ache remains because the human need for connection does not disappear with maturity. It simply changes its requirements. The loneliness of initiation asks a difficult question: can you remain with yourself without distraction, without constant validation? Without mirroring, this question is unsettling because much of identity is formed through reflection, through being seen, through being named by others. When external mirrors fade, the individual must encounter themselves directly. This encounter can feel like standing in an empty room with no script, no audience, no role to play. At first, this emptiness feels like deprivation, but slowly, something shifts. The psyche begins to discover its own presence, not as an idea, but as a lived reality. Loneliness becomes a container rather than a wound. In this container, unexamined thoughts surface, old emotions rise without interruption. The self is no longer buffered by constant interaction. They can be uncomfortable because distraction had been serving a protective function, but it is precisely this discomfort that initiates transformation. The individual learns to regulate themselves internally, to soothe without external reassurance, to reflect without approval. This builds psychological autonomy. Loneliness also reveals attachment patterns: who was needed rather than loved, where connection was used to avoid inner emptiness. Proximity substituted for intimacy. These realizations are not judgments, they are revelations. Through them, relationships are purified. Those that remain or arrive later are no longer based on mutual dependency, but on mutual presence. Loneliness as a Rite also dissolves comparison. Without constant exposure to other paths, the individual stops measuring their progress externally. Life becomes less about alignment with norms and more about fidelity to inner direction. Time slows. There is less urgency to perform milestones, less pressure to explain one's choices. The solitude becomes spacious. In this space, creativity deepens, not because of inspiration, but because of attention. Thoughts are allowed to complete themselves. Feelings are felt full. Questions are held without premature answers. Loneliness stops being something that happens to you. It becomes something you move through with awareness. The fear of being alone gives way to the fear of losing oneself in noise. This is the reversal mode. Never reached, the individual realizes that certain insights, certain depths cannot be accessed in constant togetherness. They require withdrawal, silence, distance, not as escape, but as initiation. Loneliness, in this sense, is not the absence of love. It is the preparation for a different quality of it, one that is not rooted in need, but in recognition. The Rite does not last forever, but its mark remains. Those who pass through it carry a different relationship to others. They can be with people without losing themselves and be alone without feeling Abandoned loneliness no longer threatens identity, it refines it what once felt. Like exile reveals itself as a threshold, a narrowing passage that leads inward where the self learns to stand without leaning, and in that standing, something essential stabilizes, acquired. Companionship with one's own being that does not replace human connection, but makes it possible without sacrifice. The need for recognition is one of the most subtle forms of dependency. It does not announce itself as weakness. It often disguises itself as ambition, generosity, or even purpose. The psyche learns early that being seen ensures safety, that acknowledgement confirms existence, that approval reduces the risk of rejection. Recognition becomes a mirror through which identity is stabilized. In the early stages of development, this need is natural. The self forms in relationship through reflection, through response, through feedback, but what begins as nourishment can quietly turn into reliance over time. Actions become calibrated to visibility. Choices are shaped by how they will be perceived. Effort unconsciously directed toward outcomes that will be noticed. Even virtue can become performative when recognition becomes it. Reward, this creates an invisible tether. The self remains oriented outward, waiting, adjusting, anticipating reaction. Freedom from this need does not come from indifference, it comes from maturity. The shift begins when recognition no longer delivers what it once promised. Praise feels temporary, validation fades. Quickly applause loses its ability to anchor worth. The psyche starts to sense that being seen does not equal being known. This realization can feel destabilizing if recognition does not secure identity. What does at this point? Many double down. They seek larger audiences, stronger affirmation, more refined personas, but this only tightens the dependency. Freedom begins when the individual notices the costly exhaustion of constant self-presentation. The subtle anxiety before expression, the disappointment when effort goes unnoticed. Recognition reveals itself not as nourishment, but as regulation. The self has been outsourcing stability. To step out of this pattern, the individual must risk invisibility, not as withdrawal, but as release. This risk is profound because recognition often substitutes for inner authority. When no one is watching, no one approving, no one validating, the individual must decide from within. This exposes uncertainty. Without feedback, choices feel less certain. Without affirmation, effort feels groundless. This is the threshold. Freedom from recognition is born here, not through rejection of others, but through the reclamation of internal reference. You begin to ask different questions, not how will this be received, but is this aligned? Not will this be admired, but is this true? These questions do not guarantee comfort. They require responsibility. Actions taken without recognition feel heavier at first because they are carried alone. There is no external echo to amplify meaning, yet over time something steadies. The psyche discovers a quieter satisfaction, one that does not spike and crash, one that does not depend on response. This satisfaction comes from coherence, from acting in accordance with inner values rather than external reward. The absence of recognition becomes spacious. There is room to experiment, to fail privately, to change direction without explanation. This space dissolves performance. The individual no longer needs to be consistent for an audience. They can contradict previous. The cells outgrow past expressions, act without narrative continuity. This flexibility is not instability. It is freedom. As the need for recognition weakens, envy diminishes, comparison loses relevance. The success or visibility of others no longer threatens identity. Energy returns inward. There is less urgency to announce, less pressure to justify, less desire to convince. Communication becomes simpler, more direct, less strategic, even silent. Changes character. It is no longer the silence of being unseen, but the silence of not needing to be. This shift transforms relationships. The individual no longer uses others as mirrors. They can listen without preparing a response, offer without keeping score, be present without extracting validation. This presence is felt even if it is not named. Freedom from recognition does not mean withdrawing from contribution. It means contributing without bargaining. Work becomes an expression rather than a bid. Care becomes genuine rather than compensatory. Integrity replaces image. The self stops asking life to reflect it back. Instead, it stands. This standing is quiet, unremarkable from the outside, but internally it marks a decisive liberation. The fear of being overlooked loses its grip because worth is no longer conferred by attention. The individual no longer needs to be remembered, only to be aligned. Recognition may still come, but it no longer defines direction. Praise can be received without inflation, criticism without collapse. The self remains intact regardless of response. This is the freedom most mistake for detachment. But it is not disconnection, it is self-containment, a grounded independence that allows one to move through the world without constantly checking for reflection, to act, to speak, to create without asking to be seen, and in that absence of demand. Something paradoxical occurs. The presence becomes fuller, less noisy, more real, not because others recognize it, but because it no longer needs to be recognized to exist. Living from inner authority begins when external guidance loses its absolute power, not because advice becomes useless, but because it no longer overrides inner. Knowing, the individual stops orienting life around approval, instruction, or permission, and begins listening to something less dramatic but more reliable. Inner authority is not impulse, it is not rebellion, it is not the rejection of structure, it is the capacity to sense alignment beneath noise for much of life. Authority is externalized. Rules are followed, expectations are absorbed, values are inherited before they are examined. This creates order, but it also creates dependence. Decisions are filtered through anticipated reactions, fear of disappointment, fear of exclusion, fear of being wrong. Over time, this conditioning dulls internal signals. Inner authority emerges when the dullness becomes intolerable, when the cost of obedience exceeds the cost of uncertainty. This shift is rarely sudden. It unfolds through small acts of self-trust, moments where the individual chooses resonance over reassurance, honesty over harmony, integrity over acceptance. Each of these choices strengthens an internal reference point at first. Living from inner authority feels destabilizing because certainty was once borrowed from institutions, from roles, from consensus. Without these anchors, doubt arises. Am I selfish? Am I mistaken? Am I imagining this? These questions are not signs of failure, they are signs of transition. Inner authority does not speak in commands, it speaks in clarity, a sense of rightness that does not need justification. This clarity is quiet, it does not argue, it does not persuade, it simply persists. Learning to trust it requires tolerance for misunderstanding. Others may not see the reasoning, may not agree with the timing, may interpret self-trust as defiance. Misinterpretation tests resolve. Living from inner authority means accepting the discomfort of standing alone, not because one rejects others, but because alignment sometimes diverges from consensus. The psyche learns to withstand disapproval without collapse, to hold direction without reinforcement. This builds psychological spine. Inner authority also demands responsibility. When decisions are no longer outsourced, outcomes can no longer be blamed. There is no authority to hide behind, no rule to cite, no figure to fault. This accountability is sobering, but it is also liberating. Actions become deliberate, excuses lose their function. Life becomes participatory rather than reactive. Inner authority integrates intuition with reflection. It is not impulsive. It listens, considers, waits, but when it acts cleanly. This cleanliness is felt in the body. Less tension, less second guessing, less internal negotiation. Even difficult choices feel simpler, not easier, but clearer as inner authority strengthens. Motivation changes, the drive to prove fades, the need to justify weakens. Effort is no longer fueled by fear, but by commitment to truth as it is known in the moment. This commitment allows for change. Inner authority is not rigid, it evolves. As awareness deepens, one can admit error without humiliation, change course without identity crisis, because authority resides in process rather than position. Living from inner authority also reshapes time. There is less urgency, fewer rush decisions, less pressure to keep pace. The individual trusts timing from within rather than chasing external clocks. This patience is not passive, it is attentive. Opportunities are met when readiness aligns, not when fear demands movement. Relationships shift under inner authority. Boundaries become clear, agreements more honest. There is less resentment. Because consent is real, the individual no longer agrees to what they cannot sustain nor withholds what they can genuinely offer. This authenticity may reduce quantity of connection, but it increases quality. Inner authority also transforms. Conflict, disagreement is no longer experienced as threat, but as difference. The need to convince dissolves that. Need to defend diminishes. One can state a position without aggression and hear another without absorption. Balance creates grounded presence. Living from inner authority does not mean certainty about outcomes, it means fidelity. To direction there is room for risk, for ambiguity, for not knowing. But there is no longer betrayal of self. The deepest marker of inner authority is this: even when alone, even when misunderstood, even when unrecognized, the individual remains congruent. They do not abandon themselves for relief. They do not silence inner signals for comfort. They move forward without guarantees, but with coherence. Life lived this way is quieter, less performative, less reactive. Yet it carries a weight of integrity that does not require explanation. This is the authority that cannot be taken because it was never granted, it is earned through listening, through courage, through repeated acts of self-trust. Once established, it becomes the axis around which life organizes, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but truthfully.